Recording. Good afternoon, everyone. Today is the 23rd of January, 2008. I'm Darrell Peterson, a volunteer at the Palm Springs Air Museum here in California. Part of our mission is to record and preserve the history of our country's military conflicts, especially World War II. As part of the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., we conduct interviews with veterans and civilians who participated in those conflicts. Today I'm here at the museum along with Lieutenant Colonel Tom Miller, and we're going to talk to him about his service and a lot of other things. It's nice to have you here, Tom.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
And let's start the interview by getting your full name, and if you'd spell it, please, we'll
Okay.
get started.
My name is Thomas Franklin Miller, and Miller is M-I-L-L-E-R.
Okay. Why don't you start by telling us where you were born and a little bit about that town and so on.
I was born in Seattle, Washington, back in 1929. We lived majority time in West Seattle, and I was born in the Swedish hospital in Seattle, but that didn't necessarily mean that I was Swedish. My grandmother once told me that I was Norwegian, Swedish, French, Irish, Spanish, and Pennsylvania Dutch. And I heard that at an older age, and I thought that has a lot of connotations of mongrel. But anyway, those were ancestors of mine.
Okay. And what was your father and mother's name?
My father was his name was Paul Ryan Miller. He was born in Poling, Ohio. And my mother was Edna Oliva Quinn, and she was born in San Francisco, California.
Do you know how they met?
They met after my father had graduated from Miami University in Ohio. He had a position in Seattle as the advertising manager for Westinghouse Electric. And my mother had just graduated from high school and to another school, and they met in Seattle. And that's as much as they've ever told me.
Okay. And what was your father's occupation?
He was, as I said, he graduated from college, and he was the advertising manager for Westinghouse in Seattle. And that was the position he had when I was born, anyway.
Okay. Now, this is going to be a tricky question for you, I know. And where did your ancestors come from, and why did they leave the old country?
Well,
I'll give you a chance to...
On my father's side, most of the family there was born and raised even back to great-grandparents in the state of Ohio. One of my great-grandmother's grandfather was the first white man to live north of Columbus, Ohio, in the state of Ohio. So all the Millers on that side of the family were from basically Ohio, and some of them had come up from Virginia. On my mother's side, my grandfather's name was Thomas Patrick Quinn, and if it has Irish connotations, it should, because his father was born in Galloway County, Ireland. My grandfather was born in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And with his Irish background, he became the sea captain. You want me to go in a little bit on his career while I'm at it? He, as a young lad, about 15, got a job as a cabin boy on a ship, and then he wanted to be a able-bodied seaman. And he went to sea in old square riggers with sails and all that good stuff, and he used to study. He loved to read more than I do even. And he read, and within 10 years he was an officer on ships. And when my mother and dad were married, My grandfather was the captain of the President Madison, which was a passenger ship that traveled from Seattle to the Orient and back. And he was quite a nautical man. On my dad's side, his father and his mother were both born in Ohio. And my grandfather Miller was are we on or off?
That wasn't recording.
So we can start over again?
It's on here.
Oh,
Okay.
okay, my grandfather in Ohio was Frank Miller. He was, of course, before I was born, was a secretary for a congressman and a senator in Ohio. So my father went to schools both in Paulding, Ohio, and Washington, D.C. When the senator or the congressman were in D.C. and Congress was in session, he was in Washington, D.C., and then he came back to Paulding, Ohio, where my father graduated from Paulding High School and went to Miami University. My grandmother, her family were all from Ohio, and as far as I've tracked them back, about two generations were either in Ohio or had come from Pennsylvania or Virginia.
Okay. What type of neighborhood was it that you grew up in, and did you move around or?
Well, yes, I did. I was born in the neighborhood was West Seattle, which if a person is standing in downtown Seattle looking out west to the Olympic Mountains and Elliott Bay and Puget Sound, there's a peninsula, and that's southwest Seattle, and that's where West Seattle is in the whole peninsula. For a kid growing up, to me, and even today, even more so, it was the greatest place in the world to be brought up. We had moved around a couple times with my dad's position, and by the time I was in the 5th grade, we're living in Alki District in West Seattle, and that's where I started kindergarten, and the next year we moved, and I spent the first year of school in Lafayette, which is up near the high school and near where my grandparents lived. The next year we moved to Fauntleroy District, which is south of southwest Seattle, and that's where I had my 2nd year, so I was sort of nomadic moving on the road.
You did move a bit.
And then Mom and Dad had problems and separated. And the next year, we moved to another neighborhood called Gatewood. And so this put me in the 3rd grade in Gatewood. And I was lucky enough to break all records because I ended up putting in 3 whole years at the same school in Gatewood. But it seemed to have had an advantage. All of the elementary schools in West Seattle, there were about 6 or 7 of them at the time, after the 6th grade, they all went to James Madison Junior High School, which is now called middle schools and whatever they want to call it. And one of the disadvantages a lot of kids felt was that they were in the 6th grade, they were the top dogs in their school. Now they had to go to another school and start down there with all new people and all this kind of stuff. Well, when I got back to James Madison, I'd been to 4 of the schools that all these kids had come from, and it was like old home week. You know, you knew them all, you never knew their last names. So that's where I went to junior high school, and in those days we had the 7th and 8th grade in junior high school, plus the 9th grade, which was a freshman in high school. So I finished the 9th grade and went to West Seattle High School as a sophomore in about 1945. I was lucky because it was the same high school my mother had gone to. And many years later, they had a big celebration up there in our high school that they were notifying and getting in touch with all the people that had 3 generations that had gone to that high school. Well, my mother was in one of the first classes of that high school, and at that time of their big contest or whatever it was, our family had 4 generations attending. So it was myself, my mother, myself, and my brother, and his son, his 2 sons, and a grandson. So we had 4 generations when they were talking up 3.
Wow.
High school was the greatest experience in my life. That is why after all these years, and for the last 16 years, I drive from Southern California to Seattle to go to a high school reunion, because it's, you learn, got an education through osmosis, I thought. Just by being there, you can learn something. But I got involved in all these activities that I look back on today, and they were the fun part of going to school. And in my senior year, I was lucky enough to be the vice president of the senior class. I was the president of the vice president of the Warriors, which is a service organization for the school. President of the Spike Shoe Club. I was the student producer of a spring powwow, a variety show. The sports editor of the school annual. And then turned out for football and track and was on the swimming team for 4 years. And through all those associations, you met a lot of people and you learned a lot of things about life. And looking back on it, it's the greatest experience I ever had in my life.
Now, with all these outside activities, did you have any favorite school subjects?
I did manage to get to some school subjects, yes. It seems like English and spelling were not my prime interest, but I'd say things I've enjoyed the most was history, geography. My grandfather taught me about geography at the age of 5. He, being an old sea captain, one day caught me in his office spinning the globe of the world. And when he asked me, he said, "What is that you're spinning there, Thomas?" And I says, "A spinner." And he told me that it was also a globe of the world that we live on. He said, "Let me show you something." He said, "Come over here." And he pointed there and he says, "See that?" He says, "That's Seattle. That's where we live now." And I said, "Oh." And he says, "Now, this is the Pacific Ocean. This is where my ship goes across this ocean to Japan." And I said, "Ooh, cool." I don't know if we use cool nowadays, but it sounded good. And so I thought no more of it. Until 3 days later, I'm running up and down the halls, and he says, "Tommy, come on in here a minute. I got something to show you." And he says, got over to the globe. He says, "Can you point out where Seattle is? How about the Pacific Ocean? Do you remember where Japan is?" And I've often said I wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer, but that I recognized that grandfather always asked questions about things he told you about. So I learned at an early age, when he told you something, you better remember it. And so as a result of maps, I can sit and read maps and look at maps by the hour. Geography and history came in, and those were my best subjects. I tolerated English and math and managed to get through with those.
Okay. Did you also have religious schooling or go to?
Well, my grandmother did. One year we were living at my grandparents' house, and my grandmother decided that on Sundays, beside reading the funnies, that it wouldn't hurt me to go to the Sunday school. And surprisingly, again, I met a lot of my friends today who were in the same early classes that I was.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to say that, it was just like school, except they taught us different things, how to be a good person and do all these things. And besides, they had the best cookies and fruit aid that I ever drank or ate in my life, and so I really enjoyed that.
Okay.
They were Protestant, and most of our family was Protestant in that vein.
When did you discover airplanes?
Well, in World War II, with the war starting and getting pictures of airplanes, I picked out all my favorites. And one of them was the Grumman F-3, F-4. We have one here in the museum. That was one of my favorite ones. I never got a chance to fly one until about my senior year in high school. That one of my classmates, Cullen Bates, said that he had his flying license, and he said, "Would you like to go flying?" So we went down to Boeing Field, and it was a great experience getting off the ground. You didn't know all that he did to get off the ground, but the view he had flying, and that was my first experience, and sort of whet the appetite, along with the pictures and books that I had on it.
Okay, so what year did you graduate from high school?
I graduated from West Salem High School in 1947.
Okay, so this was after World War II.
Right.
So
It was winding down. Well, we went to, it was in December 41st in Pearl Harbor. I was just going into 7th grade at James Madison.
mm-hmm.
And I'd heard about, in fact, Pearl Harbor was the day before on a Sunday. My folks and brother and I were coming back from our summer home on Lake Sawyer, which is southeast of Seattle by about 30 miles. And we were driving home, as we always did. We came to this little town of Burien, and people were running all around the streets and talking to each other. And some gentleman came up to my dad's side of the window and asked him to roll it down. He says, the Japs have bombed Pearl Harbor. And, all this scurry. So, of course, I wasn't on the cutting edge, so I thought, what is a Pearl Harbor, Dad? And instead of going into a long explanation, he reached over and turned on the radio. Well, that in itself was shocking, because as long as we had that car, when the family was in it, we never used the radio. And I don't know, was it maybe people had more important things to say than listen to the radio, but that was the first time I ever heard this. And I heard all these names of places that I didn't know what they were, and couldn't wait till we got home and brought in all the groceries and the boxes and stuff. And then I ran into the living room, and we had a big console in the living room, and I turned that on. I had my head stuffed halfway into the speaker listening, and found out it was a naval base in Hawaii and all this going on. And so from those days on, I was an avid follower.
So
And the history and the geography came in because I could find all these places on my atlas that I'd never heard of before.
Okay. So you kept up with it as you were going through school then?
Well, yeah, when I got out of high school, and this was sort of a strange thing, but I guess life is strange anyway. I didn't realize, because I was having so much fun in my senior year, that there was another year coming, and something's got to be planned. Well, my grandfather had been a Navy lieutenant in World War I, and had cargo ships taking pilings and things to France and dodging submarines and all this. And then in World War II, he was in the Puget Sound Pilots Association, and they took them all into the Coast Guard. So he was a lieutenant commander and a commander in the Coast Guard. And so where did I get off my track?
Of after high school.
Oh yeah, well anyway, I didn't know what I was going to do. Well, my granddad, because he was in the Coast Guard, says, if your grades are good enough, he says, there's a chance that I can get the senator from the state of Washington, who he knew pretty well, to get you an appointment to the Coast Guard Academy back in New London, Connecticut. And I said, oh, that sounds good. And then my mother says, well, you've always wanted to play football, but you're probably a better swimmer than a football player. She says, maybe I can get you a swimming scholarship at St. Mary's. Because St. Mary's at that year had a great football team and a great football player named Herman Wiedemeyer, and I tried to be like he was, but never came close. So I thought, well, there's two things I can do next year. I can either go to the academy or I can go to St. Mary's.
Where's St. Mary's?
In Northern California, Marengo, California, I think.
Okay.
And then I'd met a young lady, a gal, in my senior class that taught me enough to dance through the senior prom. And she happened to mention that she was going to the University of Washington next year to become a doctor, and she's going to take pre-med. So with those three options, I gave everybody one choice, and where do you think I went?
University of Washington.
University of Washington, because I'd been a football nut from there ever since about 1937. Used to listen to him on the radio, and bought my season pass in the 9th grade, and that's where I saw this Herman Wiedemeyer. I said, gosh, I sure would like to have been like him. But there's another chance to get back And then it was on the other side of town, so I says, fine. Off I went to the University of Washington.
Right. And
I had one problem, that you had to pick out what curriculum you were wanting to pursue. And some of them, I thought, there's a good one, I'll try that one, when they said you have to have a foreign language. Well, for me, my foreign language, and I thought it was very clever by telling them this, they'd say, what, have you had a foreign language? And I said, yes. And they said, what is it? I said, English. And, they smile and laugh, but that wasn't what they wanted. So I couldn't get into business, and I ended up getting into pharmacy, only because I didn't need a foreign language, and my English was good enough to qualify. So after one semester of that, I thought, no, this is not for you, because I had organic chemistry and subjects, and listen to the students talk, and they're all planning to do this and planning to do that, and none of them appealed to me. So I thought, well, maybe I'll see if I can get into the business college. So I got into BA, and apparently I now qualified with a foreign language to get in there, and got my grades up so I could stay in school, and that was my forte. And then along came the Korean conflict. In the summer, that summer I was working in a logging camp up in northern Washington, and making big money in those days, and in pretty good shape. And I came out of the woods one day, and they says, do you know about this situation in Korea? And I, well, I've heard about it. What does it mean? What is it? I said, well, you better check with your draft board and see, they may be drafting you. I said, good. I check in with that, and they didn't know definitively, but they said, well, your notice might be in the mail. So then I said, well, I can't have that. So I decided instead to join the Marine Corps. And my good friend in college, he said, I'm going to wait for the Army. So he and his younger brother and I decided to join the Marine Corps. And we went down and took the physical, and the day we were going to get our tickets to come down here to boot camp in San Diego, this one sergeant says, Miller, he says, gosh, he says, you've got 2 years and something in college. He says, have you ever thought about going through flight school? I said, no. He says, would you ever want to fly an airplane? I said, I don't think so. He says, didn't you ever make model airplanes? I said, well, I made them, but they weren't that good. And he said, why don't you do this? Why don't you go out to the Sandpoint Naval Air Station and take these flight aptitude tests? There's 2 or 3 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, and all you got to do, just take them and see. Maybe you'll qualify. And I said, well, I've overdosed on exams already. Every professor I had at the U was, he thought his was the only class I was taking, so I've overdosed on tests. I don't want tests. I don't want to take them. He says, but there's only 2 tests in the morning and maybe 2 or 3 in the afternoon. And I said, no, I'm not the least bit interested. He said, well, they also provide a free lunch. Oh? Hook. One Tommy. So off I went 2 days later, and there were 32 or 33 of us took this flight aptitude test. I had absolutely no idea what they were asking for. You just answered because you didn't know how you were going to slant it or what you wanted to slant it. It just took them. Well, I think there were only 3 or 4 of us that even passed the test. And so the guy called me in and says, gosh, he says, you passed, congratulations. He says, when are you available to go? And to show you how naive I was, and, well, first I got to go home and pack. He said, no, not today, this month, this week, or when. I said, well, whatever you need me, I'm ready. So I went home and I says, well, that's planned. Now what do I do? Well, I wasn't working, and after about 3 weeks, Dad says, Tom, he says, while you're waiting to go to war, he says, why don't you get a job?
So you switched school?
No, well, it was in the summerish.
Oh, okay.
So I was out anyway, so I thought, well, fine, I'll go find a job. And that's where I ended up working in a Dutch boy paint company in Seattle. And join the union and all those things you had to do. Still waiting to go every day. You know, I felt like I like to have another party. I'm off to war, but I wasn't going anywhere. And that's where I met my first wife.
Mm.
She worked as a secretary, and I was in the warehouse filling orders and doing all this good stuff. So that sort of covered up some of my jobs, logging camp, and then before I got called into the service.
Mm-hmm.
And having all this planned so well in advance, you know, the next thing was now I had to go to Pensacola, Florida.
So they finally called you.
Finally called me, yeah. I guess things were getting tougher and they needed more help. So Mom and Dad and my brother and my wife-to-be took me down to the train station, and there I was, setting off in my little bag with what I didn't have that many clothes to take with me. Went from Seattle down to Portland and all the way across country to Chicago, and great train ride, and then from there down the L&N down to Tennessee and Kentucky and down into Alabama, and got to a little town called Floomington, Alabama. And they said, all out for Floomington and Pensacola, Florida, and all this. And I said, well, that's my stop. So I grabbed my big bag, and off we strolled. And walking there, I said, whew, boy, it's hot here. And I thought, well, it must be the engine, the steam off of the engine. That's why it's so hot. Well, I'd gone past the train, and it was still as hot. And I got on the bus, and I says, it's still hot. And so by the end of an hour ride from Floomington down to Pensacola, I must have looked like I'd gone swimming in the clothes I was wearing. And I thought, oh boy, this is going to be fun. And that's how I entered going through flight school in Pensacola. That was my start.
Okay. So how did it go once you got there?
Well, it wasn't bad. It was very well structured. I was very impressed, and sort of got my act together because I still was so naive. I didn't know which end was up. The first Sunday we were there, the admiral of the training command came and gave a presentation to all us cadets. And they must have had, I'd say, 300 to maybe 400 or 500 at the most. We're all there, and first thing the admiral did says, he said, gentlemen, he says, I'd like to congratulate you, celebrities. You know, and I'm looking around and saying, we're some movie star that I know, or some baseball player, or whatever. And he says, the reason I call you celebrities, he says, I just want you to know where you stand. He says that at the present time, this is 1951, he says, you represent 1/2 of the draft-eligible men capable to be coming to Pensacola, Florida to go through flight training. And he says, your government at this time is willing to spend $1.5 million to teach you how to fly. And that sort of got your attention.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a great experience down there, which, you want me to continue with the march?
Yeah. What kind of airplanes did you fly?
Well,
in?
we went through ground school. We had pre-flight for about 16 weeks. This is where you learned all the things, and it was also a weed-out period. We got into navigation, and I thought, boy, navigation, I can drive anywhere. Well, navigation over water is a little different challenge. There's not too many highways or road signs. And we had navigation with charts, and you'd go here, you're on a ship, and it's going so fast, and then you're going to fly off in this heading, and you're going so fast, you're going to meet the enemy over there, and he's doing this, it's that fast. And after all that's said and done, then you got to come back to where you think the ship's going to be when you get back.
Right.
And if you don't do it right, you're swimming. So I thought, God, could anything be more difficult than this? And then you got into military justice, the history and traditions of the Navy, and then we got into celestial navigation. Now you start looking at stars and taking fixes and getting angles and looking in books, and that tells you where you're at. So I thought, this is interesting. Well, after 16 weeks, and I was fortunate, I had a Marine instructor once, and we had to learn how to drill. And each little company we were in, and we had about maybe 30 of us in our company, that we all had to get out and drill. Well, drilling's part of being in the military. Well, we also had to learn how to give commands to drill. That's more difficult than just the drilling, is getting out there. And marching your troops and your buddies around where you don't walk them over the bridge or into a building or a car or something else. So I was a little timid. I sort of knew what the commands were, and this Marine sergeant come up and he says, Miller, he says, are you giving commands or are you whispering this? It's not a secret. I want you to bell them for your stomach. So he started giving commands like this. Well, I did well enough. He says, you're one of them, and we're going to recommend you to be one of the battalion commanders. I said, oh, thank you. I didn't know what it meant, what it offered or anything else, but I found that worked out real well. And then later on the next base where we started flying, I was selected again to be a battalion commander. And you get a little extra bar on your uniform or whatever it was. Didn't pay anymore. And then we started flying. And that's where you learn, first thing you learn how to take off and land in some semblance of order. You learn very early in the game.
What were you flying then?
That was the SNJ or the AT-6.
Okay.
Which we have one of those down here. Yeah. And we'd had enough engineering back in pre-flight on it, so we know the hydraulic system, the electrical system, and the horsepower and all that stuff, and we even got to start engines back in pre-flight. So the biggest thing we had to learn is a little discipline out there in the air station and doing this, getting it started, and then not killing yourself and the instructor. And all of those were rather challenging because it was a new environment, and it came to you, they taught you how to recover from stalls. That's when an airplane, you increase the pitch and you don't have enough power, and all of a sudden it quits flying and then it falls. It then assumes the aerodynamics of a falling safe or something like that. So once you get into a stall, there's a recovery. First you got to recognize what type stall you're in and then recover from it. And if you do the right thing, and then you learn how to get out of a spin. I thought, this isn't that much fun flying. I didn't think that. But these are the things that save your bacon, because later on you'd get in acrobatics or something and you'd get yourself into a situation where you'd stall and spin, and you had to react what you were taught, not what you said. Now what do I have to do? So that was the reason we did a lot on that, and managed to get through there. My solo was a great day. I gave my commands good and loud to the instructor, who wasn't even in the back seat anymore. He's on the field, and I'm out there used to giving him checklist done and all that stuff. And then after we graduated from there, then we went to instrument flight training.
So in Pensacola too?
Still in Pensacola. We just went to another base, a little closer to Pensacola. And you get in there, and we had a lot of link trainers, and they had procedures where you couldn't see outside, and you had to fly different patterns and control your speeds and your headings. And then they got you into where you had approaches to landings, where you'd come across the radio range, and you'd hear a certain signal, and you'd turn this way for this, and get yourself down where you can make a landing, and then all of a sudden, bingo, you're over the field. Well, that was pretty essential, because sometimes you let yourself get into weather that you didn't fear enough then, but at least you knew that you had to believe the instruments and not yourself. And then it became more fun, because after we learned all that, then we got to gunnery, and could be the real John Waynes of the world.
Now what were you flying?
We were still flying the SNJ.
Oh, yeah?
Yep, we had gunnery and night flying in that, and this was out at Softly Field. And now I was lucky enough, and I was selected as the regimental commander of the cadets there, which meant I had somebody who would take the report, and he'd have the company commanders all report and all that, and then you're just sort of a liaison between the gentleman, the officer that's running the base, and yourself and your troops. And so it gave me an extra day of liberty in town, but didn't think that much of it. And that was the fun part. You got in and you got into dog fights, and we did acrobatics and a lot of things, and you thought, maybe I can fly. And then the Navy has a way of making you humble again. That they take you from there. We went to another field they called Barren, and during World War II, they called it Bloody Barren because it had numerous accidents. And this is where you go through field carrier landing practice, learning to land on an aircraft carrier. And where before you wanted to make sure you had proper airspeed so you'd never get into a stall, because now you're going to be flying maybe 5 knots faster than stall speed, hanging on the ragged edge. And you're going around in this pattern, and you're going to do this, and when you get ready to come in for a landing, you got to have the attitude, the airspeed, and the altitude, and everything, and the guy's giving you directions of what to do. When he goes, then you just chop off your power and say your quick prayer, and you land on the wire. Well, so we did it out at the field, and you're losing people occasionally because when you're at 100 feet and your engine quits, or not quits, but you stall out, you go, and so then you said, boy, this flying can be dangerous. We were still too naive to believe it. And then after we got through that, enough weeks, then we went out to the USS Monterey, which is an aircraft carrier, and to qualify and get out of basic training, which we were in, you had to make 6 landings on the carrier.
In an SNJ?
In an SNJ, yeah. And the SNJ was a little trickier than I gave it credit for, and the only accident, or the only, what I considered mishap, was on one flight. I was coming back alone back at one of the bases, and I got caught in a crosswind. And in a crosswind, you got to lower your wing a little bit, and you got to give it a little rudder, because the wind wants you to blow you this way. And I'd heard this, and the guy said, we have this crosswind coming and all that. And I said, yeah. I was sort of happy that I even found the base, let alone all this other stuff. When I made my landing, I didn't compensate quick enough, and whang, one of my wingtips went down and slapped the sidewalk, the runway, and made a nice scratch in it. Well, that was a down for that flight. And then the problem is you had to go before an admiral's board to see if he's going to keep you in the program. And, that terrorized me. And I thought, my God, I could be booted out of here. And I think there were 5 of us went over there to this admiral's board. And I said, God, and they all had different things, but the first 3 came out and they go, and I said, oh, God, he's really chopping them up. And as I was sitting there, I was next to the last to go. I says, my granddad told me something once. He says, never make an excuse. If you screwed up, you screwed up, and don't be ashamed to say so. When you're talking to somebody, look him in the face, and he says, and be optimistic. And I said, God, how can I do any of those in this system? So this admiral gets me in there, and explained this, and he said that, and he says, well, what happened when you get a wingtip? And I said, well, it was my fault. I screwed up. I says, they gave us a wind indication, and it didn't register to me that I had to do more than just think about it. And I came plodding on down, and bang, I got a wingtip. And I says, I should have known better and all this. And I was looking right at him, and he says, well, you've got a good record up to that. He says, do you think if I give you some extra time, you can make it through the program? I says, Admiral, I know I can. And I walked out there and I says, thanks, Gramps. Because that's exactly the way you did. And then from there on, I went through, and then after basic training there in Pensacola, now we went down to Corpus Christi, Texas. And we got into advanced training. And now we were checking out in the F6. And I love the F6 because the same situation that I had in my wingtip with the SNJ, you never have in an F6. And in advanced training, there were 6 of us in our flight, and we did all the learning and landing and formation flying and acrobatics, and doing acrobatics in formation, doing loops with 5 and 6 planes, and I thought, Jesus, we're getting awful hot. And then across country, my instructor, his brother, was working up at Memphis, NAS Memphis. So we took our cross-country flight up to Memphis. So we went up there and we got in there all right. And he mentioned to us, he said, my brother and all my friends are going to be out at the airport. So he says, once you guys take off, he said, I want you to go up and join up in a tight formation and come and give us permission to pass over in formation. He said, I want you to look good and sharp. Well, that's what happened. We got up there like 3 or 4 or 6 donkeys. And here he is with all his friends watching, and the airplanes come by in this tight formation. It goes, zoom, 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 zoom. You know, and you could see his antenna turning red because he screamed and yelled at us on the way home like I've never heard. But anyway, didn't affect our grade too much. And we managed to get through advance, and now we had to go back to Pensacola.
So how long had you been in training at
about
this
21
time?
months.
Almost 2 years.
And we got back to Pensacola, and now we had to do some more FCLP and then the F6. And then once we felt we were qualified there, then it was out to the big boat for the big final landing. Well, one thing I learned about the F6 was that one of the problems, of course, being not 6 foot tall, there's a lot of handicaps. You know, sometimes you got to push a lot of right rudder and you add a lot of power. Well, if you're only got your legs are only so long. They didn't have extensions for short people. But one of the problems is when you're making this approach in F6, you have your cowl flaps open so your engine doesn't overheat. Well, when it opens, you got to look. It's further harder to look out and see this guy that's got the paddles that's telling you what to do. And I says, gosh, you know, you make that final turn, you really stretch out to look at him. But the beauty in the F6, it had a sound, and as you were gearing and slowing it down to get this 5 or 6 knots above stall speed, you could hear the engine go, and the gears go, boom, boom, and then there was one, boom, you hit it, you had it locked. And you just drive that baby around, and you get plunk down and pour the coal and do it again. And I got 6 out of 6 without a wave off, because I heard that one sound, and then we got a cat shot. So with that, it meant I now had graduated. My dad came down from Columbus, Ohio for the graduation, because I offered my grandfather, who was in an old folks home, the old sea captain, and I told my mom that I would like him to pin my wings on. And so she went out and told him that, and says that you know, there was no way they could let him go from old folks home in Seattle down to Pensacola. But when she mentioned that I wanted him to pin my wings on, my mom says, first time I ever saw my dad cry. So I had my dad do it anyway, but he was stationed or sitting in town waiting for me to come back in, because we'd flown out, made our landings, and but they had a couple men on the ship that also are cadets, and I had 6 out of 6. So they said, well, I get out, he jumps in, and he tries for his 6. Well, when he either made it or didn't make them, he flew back, and I'm out in the ship. So I had to wait till the ships come in back into Pensacola. So by getting 6 out of 6, that wasn't the best deal in the world. But and then it was graduation. After I got my choice of going in the earlier in this, I'd made my choice, but we were going through naval flight training, and if you wanted to become a Marine, you had to apply to go into the Marine Corps. So that meant going before the Admiral and requesting permission to transfer. So one day I got this message that says, meet me over at the Admiral's office at 10 o'clock in the morning, and blah, 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 blah. And so didn't go out partying and shined up everything I had, and was sitting in there about 9 o'clock in the morning. I said, it doesn't hurt to be a little early. And I said, I just wonder how hostile some of these Navy pilots will be, because there's an Admiral and 4 Navy captains and a Marine major. I says, they might be upset. The Navy spent all this money on me. Now I'm going to desert them and go into the Marine Corps. So I thought, well, just shoot it from the hip. Don't say anything dumb. So pretty soon the Admiral called me in, and it was right on 10 o'clock, and I reported in, and he says, after a little mumbo-jumbo on what we're doing is according to OPNAV instruction and all this, and I says, I don't know what all this legal mumbo jumbo is, but I said, with all the ranks sitting in here, if what we're doing is not legal, it's not my sweat. I hoped. But then he asked me a question, and to this day I could kick myself for what my answer was. He says, Cadet Miller, he says, why are you interested in going into the Marine Corps? And then in my finest Sarah Bernhardt rendition, I says, all my life I've wanted to be a Marine, and on I rambled. And I thought, boy, am I laying this on good and heavy. I looked back and I said, you dork, you were lucky they didn't throw you out of the window or all of them throw up on the table, And so I said, well, I got through that. And then asked her, you had good flight grades. You just had one problem, and then academic grades were good and so forth. And the Navy passed me, and then pretty soon there was a major, and he was just taking notes. He wasn't doing anything but just taking notes. And he says, Cadet Miller, he says, this morning we've heard you had good academic grades, your flight grades were good, you didn't have any discipline problems. But he says, in the Marine Corps, we noticed that in pre-flight you're a cadet battalion commander, and out at this base you were a cadet battalion commander, and another base you were the cadet regimental commander. So he says, the Marine Corps is very impressed with your leadership qualities. I said, oh, that's nice. But he says, and based on everything we've heard, he says, we in the Marine Corps feel you might be good enough to be a Marine. To which I says, I beg your pardon, sir? And he says it a little louder and a little closer to me. We in the Marine Corps think you might be good enough to be a Marine. And I tell my kids and my family, that's what you call planting the hook. And now all I do is spend the rest of my life proving I was. I says, that's the magic. And that's still the magic.
Magic of the Marines.
Yep. So then after flight school, we went back to Corpus Christi. Went to all-weather flight, flying Beechcraft airplane, twin engine, and flying airways all around. And got through pre-flight. Was stationed out here at El Toro. And then I started flying. You want me to just keep going on my while I can remember it? It's good. Don't ask me what I had for breakfast because I'll forget that again. But we got checked out at El Toro on VM-AT-10, and I was flying the AD Douglas AD attack bomber.
Skyraider.
Yeah. And that was a going Jessie, that plane. Mm-hmm. And of course we were starting off flying the AD-1, and then they had the 2 and the 3 models there. And my first flight out of El Toro was, I says, well, you have your checklist, you go through there, you've learned all about the engines and all this kind of stuff, but you've never flown it. And one of the things, you have a checklist, and you go through and you check everything and do it. But if you keep going through it enough times, pretty soon you're back doing opposite of what you should have been doing. One of the things I neglected to do was roll enough forward trim tab so that as the airplane built speed, it wouldn't have a tendency to want to climb straight up. So I said, I got to make a good landing because I know everybody's out there watching this crazy landing, or this takeoff. I said, oh God, just make it good. Just get off the ground, don't fall back down. Took off, and all of a sudden I raised my gear and started coming the flaps, and all of a sudden that plane's nose come up, and I was pushing all the way forward that I could push, and I was still climbing sky, and I couldn't get any further because I hadn't put in enough forward trim tab. I must have been at 10,000 feet before I ever got enough where I could push over level. And I said, oh boy, you're gonna catch sick for that one. And then I learned that, oh God, one little thing and you're a clown.
Airplanes are unforgiving.
Yeah, and they are very unforgiving. So we got through there, and we came down here to El Centro and the Chocolate Mountains, and did a lot of rockets and bombing, and some up Mojave, and then off we went to Korea.
And Korea was still going.
Pardon?
Korea.
It was still going when we got there, but I think they got smart because they probably looked at the manifest of people coming in the country, and they saw that name Tommy Miller. They said, we better sue for peace. Because they had their first slow down or stoppage just about the time we got there. We'd been there about a week or so, I guess. And I was in a night attack squadron, which we did all our bombing and rocketing.
And you were flying the Sky Raider, yes?
Still the Sky Raider. Now we were in the version 2 and 3s, the later version of them.
Okay.
And you would do bombing and rocketing under searchlights or flares. You know, they'd put flare and you'd go after it. Or searchlights weren't as bad, but under flares, once you get underneath that flare, it's the brightest light you ever saw in your life. And if you don't, you know, have one eye closed and once you get under that bright light and pull up, you're blind. You can't see a thing. Well, who made a great run on all that kind of stuff, but and Picklet and that coming up, and I said, God, boy, you lost your night vision and you're blind as a bat.
Yeah.
I said, oh, that's swift. That's fun. But anyway, in Korea, I managed to get through. We lost about 4 or 5 different pilots, little thing, because the AD wasn't a very forgiving airplane. It was great, a lot of power, a lot of horsepower. I always felt they shaved a lot of tolerances to give you that extra horsepower, and or I felt some of my problems was I had a dive bombing run where I had about 800 or 1,000 pounds of ordnance. We rolled in from 20,000 feet, and we're pickling this off and pulling out, and for some reason when I pickled, nothing came off. And you, and I started pulling G's, and I was sitting like this, you know, instead of your back firm. I got that thing there, and we must have pulled 7.5 or 8 G's, loosened and popped a couple rivets on the wings, and when I got back to the base, I said, I'm having trouble getting out of this plane. So I screwed up my back a little bit.
Wow.
And I still go to a chiropractor to every so often get popped back into shape, but nothing big. But you know, you learn if you live long enough, and so that was a good experience.
So how long did Korea?
That was 14 months we were served over there.
14 months you were flying combat in Korea.
Yep. And I made a couple dumb choices. I had one friend of mine who was a great pilot for Eastern Airlines. He used to take on Sundays and take a plane and go out and fly instruments. And we didn't have that, you know, he had any instrument, whether you tried to stay away from it, you didn't go after it.
Right.
But Charlie did. So one time we were out, and he's been doing this for maybe for 6-7 weeks and pretty well accomplished. And he said, why don't you come down, we're going down to fly down to Daegu, which is K2, and there's a great USO show down there. And oh God, you gotta go. So myself and my buddy said, oh yeah, we'll go with you, Charlie. Well, as we got closer to the day of launching, it was IFR. There's a chance we may be socked in when we get there. And I says, ooh, this isn't too good. But we were flying wing on him. We were in as close, because once we got down there, and then they put us in a holding pattern. Now you start making turns. And every time you make a turn, you think you're turning this way and diving down, and you're up this way, going up, and vertigo had it. And I said, I'm going to hold on to that plane. I said, if I lose him, you know, and I had my little wingtip light flashing right behind his cockpit. I said, if I lose him, I've got to bail out. I don't know if I'm upside down or inside out. Yeah, don't have a clue. We came out. He finally got us on the approach, and when we landed, we were so low, we couldn't even drop behind each other. We had to land almost 3 abreast on the run, which really got their attention.
Impressed them.
Okay. But anyway, so that was the experience, and lucky to come back, because one of the saddest things, when we left El Toro, there were about 7 of us, second balloons, went over together, and one of them was killed, and his wife had come out there, and when we left. And when we got back to El Toro, she was standing there. And she'd already been notified, but she says the only way she can convince herself that he wasn't coming back was that see the rest of us that did. So this is a tough occupation here, Tom. It's got some
So were you married during that period, or when did you get married?
I got married in right after flight school, so I'd been married about 16, 17 months.
Okay.
Yeah.
Your wife was back in Seattle?
She was back in Seattle, yeah, working I think she probably worked in the same place I was, so when I met her.
Mm-hmm.
Lived with her mom and dad. So
Okay.
I came home the
So
hero.
what happened after Korea? Then things kind of tapered
Well-
down in the combat. But,
Well, we came back to Seattle, and then I had orders for El Toro.
so had you intended to stay in the Marines?
Well, I was
then,
on a
or-
4-year, what they call a 4-year SWAG, sworn written agreement.
Oh, okay.
So you're on for 4 years. Well, I was a reserve all this time, and I
Mhm.
figured, well, I'll see if the next duty station's good and good stuff, I'll stick with it. Otherwise, I'll get out and look for something.
Yeah.
I didn't know what I was going to look for, but I was going to. And I kept getting, they all seemed pretty good. So I fortunately was able to eventually retire as a reservist. Because usually they didn't get that far along the road. They got ready when they said, well, thank you for your 8 years or whatever it was, bye.
Mhm.
So I came back and got here at El Toro. Got in another AD squadron flying the AD-5N, which was a dual airplane that had a lot of electronic stuff and countermeasures and all that. And one day in Korea, though, on a Sunday, I went up flying with this guy that was our search and rescue helicopter pilot. And he said, "You ought to try this thing." And I said, "Well, yeah." And of course, it was just the opposite of it. When you add power in a fixed wing, you push that. In the helicopter, you add power, and it's this one. And if you ever rode a motorcycle, or just backwards on the hand grip, so it could be a lot of excitement. So I landed, and I thought, God, this isn't bad flying, this helicopter stuff. And I said, boy, you can be real organic with the Marines. You're setting down there in their landing zones and all this stuff. So I thought, God, I get back, I'm going to apply for helicopter school.
Okay.
So I did, and God, they were taking a lot of majors, sending them, and I was just a first lieutenant now, and God, I walked up to the wing every week, and I think, is there any chance that I may be be called to go to Pensacola? And, well, when your turn comes, it'll come.
Mhm.
Well, the only reason I think I ever got to Pensacola and flight school for helicopters was that they had a major was scheduled to come in from Kaneohe, and they were going to send the name into headquarters of the Marine Corps that this major is here and we're ready to send him. Well, for some reason he never came.
Hmm.
So now they said, oh God, now we got to come up with a name. Well, I said, good Lord to heaven. I come strolling through the door. He said, Miller, you finally got it. So off I went down to Pensacola again to go through helicopter training.
Okay. And what year is this now?
It's about 54.
Okay.
And then I got into helicopters through HTL and the hub down there was a Pisaki thing. Are we doing all right on time-wise here?
We gotta change tapes
Okay.
here.
Okay, I see a red light flashing at me, and I'm,
Okay.
where was I? Somewhere helicoptering?
Yeah, you were just starting the helicoptering.
Yeah, I went
Went
to,
back to Pensacola.
yeah, I went back, this was 1955. I was at Pensacola, going through Ellison. Okay?
Okay, go.
And came back to Santa Ana at the old LTA, the air facility there. And I eventually got into a squadron called 361, which was just a helicopter squadron. We had a lot of maneuvers up at 29 Palms, a lot of them down at El Centro and Yuma. And a lot of times coming back from Yuma, going to Santa Ana, we'd take well, I call it the 810 Yuma, the railroad track. You can follow it. And a lot of times, the weather might be a little on the poopy side. And if you can get through Beaumont, you're safe all the way to Santa Ana.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes he says, gosh, I don't know if you can get through tonight. And I said, well, why not? And he said, well, we don't know, the weather's awful bad up at Riverside and there. So I'd call the highway patrol and find out what the height of the ceiling in Beaumont. And they said, well, it's 150 feet here. I said, good, we can make it. Because if you get through there, then because Beaumont's higher, and then you get back down to
Yeah.
Santa Ana. So we had a lot of maneuvers doing that. We made a lot of carrier landings. The Marine Corps was really going strong now on helicopter employments and development, and so we had more maneuvers on carriers out here than I can shake a stick at. And then one of them was interesting. We were going up to Desert Rock, and this had to be 1957. They were having an atomic bomb display, and they had the troops involved and airplanes involved, and we were going up there to fly some of our troops to the cloud. And this was probably in July, so the weather up there is like it is here in July, and you're in tents, and we had our helicopters sitting out there in the dust waiting for the day when the bomb went off. And it was so miserable and so hot that some of us brought little ice chests. And once the ice melted, we had cold water. But laying there in the afternoon trying to fall asleep, you'd soak your towel and wrap it around your head and then lay down in your bunk and try to fall asleep while you were still cool. And then another phenomenon that I never knew happened in the desert was that you'd been scorching out there all day. You know, your mouth is dry as sandpaper. And the sun is finally going down, and you see it drop on the side of the mountains. You say, "Oh, thank heavens!" And then it pops up over here in a matter of hours. It's ready to hit you again. So we were there for about 6 days of this. You know, and you're standing up in mess hall. They have a tin tray, and you're eating it. And the wind blows, and you're eating half a pound of sand. And I thought, "Oh, this is just to see an atomic bomb." I says, "Gosh, this is not. I don't think it's that great." But went through that, and then finally the day of the launch. Some of the kids volunteered, some of the troopers and a couple of pilots, to go out and stand in a trench closer to ground zero. And I said, lunatics. So we were back, and we were issued our dark glasses, and we had to turn our backs and all that when it went off. You know, the shock wave would hit you, and then the dust would blow you, and I thought, oh boy, this is really fun. But, you know, it was awesome to see how bright it was, even with dark glasses and your eyes closed, because later on, next year, I found out it was even more exciting. But after they were all, you know, they busted off the dust, and they checked their dosimeters, and they didn't have too much radiation. So they said, now we want you to go out there and pick up these troops, and you're going to fly them through this area. I says, God, this gets more ridiculous by the hour. So we did. We got them up and we picked them. And it was hot enough there, so you had a hard time lifting 6 people in the old H-19. And with high temperatures and high humidity and low morale and everything else.
Well, wasn't there any concern about radiation?
Well, we did. We all carried little dosimeters, and it could tell you how much you got.
Okay. So
I was concerned, you know, I was saying, well, I'm probably sterile as a lamppost now, but that's the way it goes, you know. Nothing's too good for me and my country. But anyway, we came back after that, and I said, God, will I be glad to get back to Santa Ana. They said, oh, you missed the, we got one thing left to go on. What? He said, the truck ride. We all had to climb in the back of a 6x, and they took us out to ground zero.
Oh my God.
I said, Jesus Christ. I can't believe it. But anyway, we got back Santa Ana, and I said, boy, wasn't that a fun time? That was the best maneuver I'd ever been on. Well, we did so well in that atomic exercise in 1957 that 6 months later we were informed that we are the helicopter squadron that is going to Bikini. And we provide the helicopter transportation in the Bikini Atoll for the atomic exercises.
This was atomic or hydrogen?
Both.
Both.
We went out there in Bikini, and we had to set up a taxi service. I was the operations officer, so I played like it was just a taxi service. We had a guy on the microphone and check in. I'm over this island. We're dropping here. I said, put the names of your manifest in that box, and so you always know who was in the helicopters. But you get out there to Bikini, and you know, they'd had so many of those out there anyway that you couldn't eat the fish. you couldn't eat the coconuts because they're all radioactive. And I said, God, the only exercise out here is swimming in the lagoon or playing volleyball. You know, the wind was always blowing, so you had a crosswind, and it took us 2 months to learn how to play volleyball. When you hit here, it's going there. But I said, God, we ended up out there, I think, for 11 or 13 shots.
Wow, I didn't realize they had that many.
And when we turned, on one of them, I says, was the one I peeked, you had your dark glasses, and we were a good ways, because this was way up on Charlie, and we're back down in Elmer, 10, 20 miles, it seemed like, far. You turn away, and you close your eyes, and there's bingo, and I opened my eyes, and I could see the bone in my hand, my arm.
Oh,
And then you look down under the glasses, and you could see every corner of every blade of sand on that beach.
Oh.
It was that sharp thing. Ooh, awesome. But, you know, Holmes and Narver were the construction people, and they had the greatest mess hall you ever ate in your life. You ate, food was outstanding, gosh. Amazing we didn't all end up being 1,000 pounds heavier. Well, half of the squadron was going to stay because they were going over to Johnson Island, where they had and we had a carrier, the Boxer was out there with us. I was in an advance party that flew out, but some of them came out with the helicopters aboard the Boxer, and it was anchored out there in the lagoon. But so some of them had to go aboard the Boxer, and they went to Johnson Island and got involved in the other big bomb. But I said, well, that's the end of my family. Well, it didn't come out quite that way. I think I only had 5 children after that.
Oh my!
So something I missed, but it was a different experience. Not everybody gets to involve in 2 years, seeing that many.
So how
yes.
long were you out there?
We were there about 8 months.
Okay, so you're on the island. Okay.
You know, it was good swimming. The only thing you had to worry about there was because we used to swim and dive for helmet shells or these giant clams. You know, and then the other fashionable thing to catch was on the beach. They had a lot of these glass bulbs that Japanese people use on floats. But they have balls this size up to huge ones, and whenever you saw one, you said, whoop, there's one. You sit down and pick it up. So I still have a couple of them left over, collecting glass balls.
Yeah.
But one time we were out swimming, and I says, gosh, you know, there's a lot of sharks out here, isn't there? Don't they get hungry and all this stuff? Radiation bother them at all? But and then to make it worse, he said, we're swimming in the lagoon, and we'd take an inner tube and put a board on the bottom, and we'd get a nice helmet shell, and we had to learn how to get down to 30 feet, and you had to clear the pressure in your ears going further on down.
Yeah.
And then you'd come up, you'd have your helmet shell, and you'd put it in the tube, and you're about maybe a quarter of a mile off the beach. Well, I did that one day, and the next day I was out fishing, and off this little reef thing, and I had my pole, and I saw these little fish swimming around. They were little sharks about this size. And so I'm wagging the pole in the water, and they go wham, wham, 3 of them there smash it like. They don't know that that's not even bait. That's the end of the pole, and they were whang at that. And I said, ooh. So 2 days later, we're out fishing for helmet shells, and we're just about coming up, and I saw this shadow go, and I thought, God, one of the little launches that they had went cruising by. I says, that launch has got tail. It's moving. And I says, geez, if I ever get out of here, I'll never come back. I'll never come back. Got out of there, and the shark was about the size of a boat. And you're in his element. And I seen what his little great-grandson is doing back. I said, that was the end of my aquatic life out there. But then, you know, then they have movies. You know, they had a couple, you could only drink beer, but every movie had to be a shark movie for some reason. And they say, don't wear white, don't wear this, don't. I said, what can you wear? You know, that's nothing. You stay out of the water. You don't sweat that. So that was an interesting experience. So that was my first squadron tour in the helicopters. So my family was living in Costa Mesa, and it was getting larger. And I says, gosh, you know, I've had almost 3 years here now. That's pretty good. It's about time Uncle Sam heads me across the pond. And no, they said they're going to transfer me to the air station in Santa Ana. So I moved from this operating squadron to the air facility. And I was one of the air operations officer on the base.
Mm-hmm.
I said, gosh, I can handle this, because that's another 2 years there. So my family, we had it great in Costa Mesa.
Yeah. So you had re-enlisted then?
Well, I just real swagged
re-signed.
over, yeah. I says, gosh, you know, then he said, God, I got a lot of mouths to feed. I said, I don't know where they're all coming from. Must be the water. But then finally it came to the day where I said, gosh, now I've had 2 years here at the air station, flying the Beechcraft, the SNB again, and we'd fly to Alameda and a couple places around, and that's as much instrument or flying time as you got. And then I had orders again. I said, well, I know where I'm going. Going this way.
Yeah.
So sure enough, I had orders and ended up going to Japan, and then I was going down to Okinawa. And they just built this new helicopter base in Okinawa called Fatima. And getting acclimated there pretty good. And I thought, gosh, this is pretty good duty here in Okinawa, not that bad. I wanted to get into an operating squadron where I could do more flying. But then they gave me a job as an executive officer of the squadron, which I hated.
Mm.
And it was all paperwork, and the kid's in trouble, and you're spending more time trying to keep them out of trouble. And I said, God, this is a fun-packed job.
Mm.
So when I very discouraged, I decided that they came up and they had a secret interview. They were recruiting people for a mission which they couldn't divulge.
Mm.
I says, that sounds like my piece of cake. So I told the skipper, Colonel Johnson, I says, I'm going to go and check that out. He said, no, you don't. You won't be interested. I said, well, I'm going to check it out anyway. And he was probably happy that he had somebody to help him do all the shuffling of the paper. But so I went over and applied, and they said, how many hours do you have? And I said, oh, about 3,000 or 4,000 hours in helicopters. Oh, have you done that? Oh, yeah. Everything was going peachy keen, and he says, oh, by the way, he says, are you married? I said, well, yes, yeah. And he says, oh. And that wasn't a good oh, you know, it was, oh. And he says, do you have any children? I says, yeah, 5. He said, well, Captain Miller, he says, I want to thank you for coming in, and we'll keep you in mind.
Mm.
So I thought, well.
So where was your family at this time? Were they back
They
in
were
the
still in Costa Mesa.
Okay.
You know, that's the longest they ever stayed in one place their life.
Yeah.
So while they were there, and I used to say that, you know, poor wife had 5 kids and all this other kind of stuff going on, and I said, well, at least she has the love and comfort of my family, and I'm out here fighting loneliness for myself, you know. That didn't go over too well. She wasn't the least bit impressed with that.
Uh-huh.
So I was sitting there, and I thought, well, I'm destined to be a paper shuffler, and bingo. Both the colonel and I now have to go over for a meeting at group headquarters.
Mm.
And they were forming a task organization. And they were going to build it around. We were in a Marine Air Base Squadron, which provides all your housekeeping facilities and your medical and the transportation and all that, you know, fun packed, no airplanes, but a lot of things. So then they attached a segment of the headquarters and maintenance squadron, which does all the maintenance on helicopters. And I says, ooh, this is a promising site.
Back to the airplanes.
Then they gave us a security infantry platoon.
Mm.
And then from the division, a engineering platoon. And then some communicators.
So you started
So
building up.
then we start reading messages that now were top secret.
Mm.
So I says, okay, where are we going? And I said, I got a sneaking suspicion. And we ended up flying down to Clarkfield in the Philippines and over to Bangkok, Thailand, and then up to Udorn, Thailand. And we set up our little housekeeping in Udorn, Thailand. And another beautiful day, you know, it's 135 and 95 humidity. And, you know, you're grounding when you're walking upright.
That's what all that Pensacola training was.
Oh yeah, that really acclimated me. And then we were in tents, and so we provided helicopter maintenance and transportation and stuff for people flying up in Laos. Enough said on that. But first of all, we were living in tents, and then we found out during the monsoons, half of the area we were in would be underwater. So we moved over to the other end of the field where they had a couple big hutches where they had the people that did the maintenance work and built these runways, big cement runways, where they live. Of course, now it's infested with snakes and everything else, and we had to clear that out and make. One was going to be a mess hall, one was going to be some of the offices, and then we had to build pilings, and we had to hire we got in real close with the chief of police in Udorn, a general that was on the 13th Regimental Command of the Thai Army, and with three of us, anything we needed we seemed to get. So they said, well, we need some of this lumber because we need pilings, because we had to build our camp off, and so we in essence almost took over a sawmill. And then the difficulty the poor engineers had was that you're using wood that's almost like mahogany, and they're driving nails like that big. They looked like they were made of solder, and driving it in. And those engineers, my God, they could drive a nail in one of those nails that size in about 2 strokes. And we built all our camps, and then we made a deck, and then we strung back all the tents. So now we were about 3 or 4 feet off the ground, and we had to do the same things for the chemical toilets and everything else. But it was nice during monsoon because the water was about this deep underneath us. And of course, cleaning out these buildings to make the mess hall and all that, we came across, and they saved samples of nice cobras and banded crates, some of the nicer snakes in the world. It's nice to know our neighbors. But we got through there. That was 8 months of fun and frolic. That was different. You don't do that.
Did you get much flying during that time then?
I did on a lot of the test tops, because I knew some of the pilots very well that had volunteered that were accepted and I wasn't. And so anytime they had a lot of base test flying, I was getting a lot there. And then I got a couple of chances to fly up to Vientiane up in Laos. But the colonel says every time you did, he says, anything ever happened to you when you're in Laos, he says, you went AWOL. So he says, be my guest, you know. And I did. I mean, I didn't go AWOL, but I
you got back.
Flew around up there and saw how the other world was operating. And that was an interesting 8 months. A lot of intrigue. You met people, because we were the only operating squadron in the entire Marine Corps. We had, besides the American ambassador, came up and visited us about 3 times, and I had to give a presentation on what we were doing. Another organization called an American Source would brief me, and then I could brief some of the things that were going on. And you had the American ambassador, and every general from the Marine Commandant on down, Cinque Pat, Admiral Felt, and all of them were coming by to see what we were doing. And so we were little nothings. I said, boy, we're on the point of the spear.
Yeah. So this was before a lot of troops came into Vietnam.
Yes, and a lot of them that came to us and checked out how we were doing this and doing that ended up as being some of the first ones that went into Vietnam, especially helicopter.
So this was about, what, 62? So
well, it's on my notes. When was it? Thailand, 1961. Yeah, with Air America. about 61, somewhere in there, yeah.
Okay.
And that was a good 8 months, you know, and you learn to live in a tent, and finally got a fan. And the biggest thing the fan was could keep the mosquitoes off you. They couldn't. But I laugh when sometimes the first year I was here, I was going up to get my mail at La Quinta, and it was up to the clubhouse where the mail room is. It was about 120. And I'm strolling up there to get my mail. This guy says, boy, you won't be able to do that this summer. I said, well, I thought this is summer. He said, well, it'll be too hot to get your mail. And he said, you can't do that. I said, oh, you know all about me? You know. So then I told him, I says, well, I've had a temperature of 135 and humidity up to that, and lived in a tent and did it for 8 months, and you tell me I can't walk up here and get my mail? I said, watch me. So I guess you do pick up something, and I don't let the heat bother me, but
Marine training took over.
Tough. Sometimes dumb, but tough. So you did learn a lot. And that was another interesting interlude in my life. It was nice being executive officer of a squadron. You know, you learn that facet of it. And again, I'm still a reserve flopping along. Got back to the base, and then I was the executive officer of the headquarters and maintenance squadron for a little while. And then I got orders to Quantico, Virginia. I'm coming back there to the Marine Corps' Amphibious Warfare School. That's about a 1-year schooling. So I went back there and flew with HMX for about 4 months before the school started. And then we got back there, and it's a school designed primarily for the Marine on the ground. And I always falsely accuse them of inviting all us aviators in because they're going to grade on a bell curve, and it's all ground operations, and so we're down here ringing the sour notes and whatever. But then even the aviators, you know, they got a little snickety. They would talk to their ground brother and then say, but, you know, in aviation, you know, it's us fighter pilots, you know, we're going through space and breaking sound barriers and this, and then it was the attack pilots, and they're dropping bombs and machine gunning and shooting and rockets and all this. And even the transport pilots were saying, well, we bring in the bear and we do this and we take out the wounded, blah, blah, blah. And the lowest things on the face of the earth were the helicopter pilots, you know, way down below whale droppings or something. And then came the Cuban Missile Crisis. Another tricky question. Guess who were the only ones that were pulled out of the school to go to take part in the Cuban Missile Crisis? The helicopters. Yeah, I got there one Sunday, told my wife, I said, well, it looks like I'm going, I got to pack up Sunday, and Monday morning we're going down to New River, North Carolina.
So your family was in D.C.?
They were in the Quantico area, yes. And so, you know, that's just the way it was. They adapted to it and went down, and they formed a new squadron, and they said, well, Tom, or my nickname is Chesty, and they said, Chesty, you got to fly down to Jacksonville and pick up 2 helicopters. One of them's ready to be picked up. Go down there and pick that up and bring it back. Well, I didn't even unpack yet. And I came back, and he says, gosh, he says, you were picked for another good deal. I said, what's that? And he says, you're going to have a 4-plane detachment, and you're going to fly down, and we don't know if you're going to where you rendezvous, but you got to get in touch with the war room in Cherry Point, and they're going to give you the PIM and the Charlie time and the carrier you're going to rendezvous with. I said, oh, well, I just call as I got. And they said, so all the way down I was calling them. Of course, they were busy. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and everybody's on toes alert. And plodded on down, couldn't get them, so I kept going on down. I got to one place by Cape Canaveral, and the Air Force officer says, oh, he says, where are you headed? I said, I'm down here somewhere. And he says, boy, Southern Florida's getting crowded with airplanes. So I said, tell me, you know, you see them and hear them. He said, but just some information for you, you know, out on the islands out there in, not Bimini, but the islands on the chain, he says, our little Air Force base out there now has 115, 145 fuel. It's not in any chart, so nobody will know it, but if you ever need it, it's there. And I said, oh, that's good, Captain. I said, I'll tuck that away. So we finally got to Florida, and I said, well, when you get down there, you're going to have to stay at the Coast Guard station. It's the only space they have left available. Okay. Got there, and they were full. So they said, well, check with Miami International. They were now parking helicopters between the runways inside. I said, oh, this is really getting fun. So we set up a sentry, and I had my other Marines. I said, bring your weapons with you. And I said, we have these chits, and I says, for you enlisted, meals and board and room are on Uncle Sam. And I said, officers, I think you better pay, because if they don't reimburse you, you're going to be out. So we went in and got a motel, and here we walked in with about 8 officers and 16 enlisted and carrying weapons. I says, I need so many rooms. He says, what about so many rooms? And in they came, and I says, somebody check, stay with the weapons. And then, of course, they ate like there was no tomorrow. The enlisted guys, they were eating prime rib and all this, and I guess the officers were too. And I finally got a hold of the war room. And they gave us the PIM and the Charlie time of the ship that we were going to rendezvous with. Was 65 miles east of a little island out there called Lithia or something. So I says, good. They said, how do you plan to get there? And I said, well, I'm going to leave Miami International here tomorrow about 5 in the morning, go up to West Palm, and then I'm going over to this base and refuel there. And he says, you can't get fuel there. We've checked it, and there's none of the charts show it. I said, well, I was told that there would be gas there, and that's where I'm going to refuel. He said, well, you can't do that. I says, what do you suggest, sir? He said, well, if you do it, it's your responsibility. I says, adios. So we did. But I was a happy camper as we were approaching that base, and I made my call, and I saw that refueling truck heading our direction. And the Air Force did a great job. They refueled us. They had coffee and donuts and stuff, and we just gassed up and then plodded on the way around the chain. Well, we finally got to this island of Lithia, and then I had to figure out a point of no return. If we're heading due east, at a certain point, if we don't have any clue where the carrier is, we got to turn around and come back to land on the beach, on dry land. So I had that plotted, and the further we got away, I had Miami approach control was following us on radar a little bit, because we were so low that pretty soon they lost us. So I thought, God, I says, my TACAN, I'm not getting any reading at all. And so my co-pilot, who was a little naive and nice, he says, Skipper, he says, what's the next landfall? I says, Africa. He said, and I said, well, that's the next landfall out there. I said, hopefully we're going to pick up this carrier, and we hope to get a TACAN. So then I had all the 4 planes check me with the fuel that they carried aboard. And this one guy had about 75 to 100 pounds more than the rest of us. And I said, number 4, I said, what I want you to do, I want you to just add on a couple of inches of power, not a lot, and just cruise on up another 1,000 feet higher than we are, and see if you can get anything on your TACAN, because I'm not even getting movement of it. And he did, and about 15 minutes later, he says, yeah.
Wait a minute. Something happened here.
My light's still blinking.
Okay, we're back on the air.
That has been doing funny things over there. Are you on?
It says record, so.
Okay, you're recording. Okay, go ahead, keep going.
Okay,
Okay,
we're in the middle of the
So there we were.
Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yes. Okay, we are, as we were going, he went up about 1,000 feet higher than us, and he says, Skipper, he says, my needle is swaying about 30 degrees on each side. And I says, that's encouraging, because mine hasn't moved since we left. And I says, give it a little more. He says, oh, it's narrowing in on it. And I said, okay, now just crank off about a ½ an inch of power and slowly come on down and join us. And he did, and about 10 minutes later I said, ha, mine was beginning to move. And then pretty soon as it gets closer, then I said, good, we got a click. And I says, we're 65 miles out. And I says, everybody's got a good fuel state? Yep. I says, okay, we got it whipped. So we cruised on then, and we got a little closer, and then I called the ship and told them 4 Marine helicopters coming in. I said, God, signal Charlie, you have permission to land. So I said, okay, gang, tighten up this formation. We don't want to look like a bunch of raggedy-ass Marines on parade. Get in here tight. So we went boom, 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 and we came over the ship and it was pow, 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 pow. You got to play the role.
Right.
And so we got aboard and met one of my friends that I'd known a long, long time, and he says, the commanding officer of the air group wants to talk to you, and he says, I went up and saw him, and he says, Miller, he says, we're making you the officer in charge of the helicopter detachment in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. I says, oh? He says, yeah. He said, you got the 4 birds here, and there's 1 Navy H-19 down there, and he says, that'll be yours also. So get on the base, get it set up, and you'll have the helicopter detachment. And he says, we'll drop you off tomorrow morning. We're going to swing around the hook of Cuba, and you'll be off flying tomorrow morning. He said, get a good night's rest. Yes, sir. So the next day, I am the officer in charge of the helicopter detachment. I said, boy, this is a long way from school.
It is.
And we were there flying the fence line quite a bit. And not that it made much difference, but I used to say, when we did, the Cubans would sit there with their guns, you know, as we went plodding along. I said, why don't we start flying about 10 knots slower than we normally do? I said, what? I said, why? I said, maybe they just get used to that speed, and if we kick it up when we're really in a hurry, it might be to our advantage. We have nothing to lose, we'll save gas. So we did, and I had the troops buckled down, and we lived in the officers' area outside of the main line of resistance. So we had to go through a checkpoint every night, even to get to the quarters where we were staying. And then one night we're sitting there, and I'm up, been a long day, and we've done some flying and a little bit of this, and we're listening to the 6 o'clock news at the officers' club. And they're talking about the current negotiations and the missile crisis and all this, and they said, well, some of the people are now advocating that we use limited nuclear weapons in Cuba. Time out. I'm here. Tommy's here. I said, oh, that's nice. That's nice to hear. And it didn't come to pass, so we didn't see it. But 2 days later, they had an alert. I thought, oh, God. And what had happened apparently was that some laborer came through and was under the weather and crashed the main gate. Well, that pushed the buttons, and all my pilots were streaking out to the helicopters, and the ADs were taking off with full bomb loads and all this kind of stuff. And I thought, oh, God, this is it. So we had to go down, and we're going to land in this place where the regiment was and pick up our troops and take them up to the fence line. Yeah, and I said, oh, it's nice because you have to land on a narrow road because on either side is mined. And I said, well, now you're the officer in charge, so everybody had already got in the planes, and I got the last briefing. I said, don't run, pretend like you've done this before. So I walked at a fast gait and jumped in the plane. I said, take off, take off. He said, you're strapped. I said, get out, take off. That was for show. And we picked our troops up and went up there, and then they found out it was this guy, so I thought, oh, that's interesting, you know, another little bit of intrigue. And then eventually the negotiations wore down to the point where we went out and photographed the missiles being taken back out on Russian ships leaving. So we got that, and then they flew us back to the States, and got back to Quantico and said hello to the family, got back to school. I said, well, you guys are going to have to come back. You got a lot of time to make up. You've been gone about 4 or 5 weeks or more, or whatever it was. And they says, you're going to have to come in on Saturday and Sunday for a couple of days and catch up with the class. I said, oh, great. They've done good. So anyway, I graduated, surprisingly, from that class. Then I went down to HMX, which is Marine Helicopter Squadron 1, and who has 3 missions. One is in support of the Marine Corps schools and all those things. They also do all the research and development for Marine Corps helicopters, and anything to do with helicopters, they do it there. And then they have the Executive Flight Detachment. And I was being groomed because they'd been working on my clearance for 9 months or 18 months to get not only update my top secret clearance, but to get a White House clearance.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it takes a long time to get all that. So then they said, well, you've got it. We're going to send you down to Key West, Florida to go through helicopter training in this particular helicopter. That it's a Navy submarine airplane, or a submarine aircraft. That they use it for sonar dipping and so forth. So that's what we had to learn to fly, and got back up there to Quantico and got into the mission. And flew a lot of big wigs. Usually initially the commanding officer of the squadron was the presidential pilot, and the mission was split between us and the Air Force. They, from Camp Davidson, a little north of us, had their CO was the presidential pilot, and they had so many birds and we had so many, and the COs could alternate so they wouldn't be on duty 24 hours a day. We went along with that for a while, and pretty soon the Army was getting out of the mission some way, and we had to take over the whole mission. So then the next problem occurred that our poor commanding officer couldn't be on duty 24 hours a day, every day of the week. Mm-hmm. So then they designated 4 pilots to be presidential pilot, command pilots that would fly the president. And luckily I managed to get myself into that category. And then I was, up until then, I'd been the White House liaison officer. And I'd go up there to the White House and I'd have a trip planned and certain people that I'd contact and get all the information on. And then I got a chance to be the advance officer. So any visit outside of the Washington area, we'd go up with the Secret Service and the Air Force One crew and the political advance people and set up all the procedures for flying in the president, picking him up and moving him and all that. And did about 5 or 6 of those and felt pretty good. And then,
who was president at this time?
Well, first it was Kennedy when I was first there, but we were on duty when he was assassinated in Florida. Because our radio room...
Texas, you mean?
In Texas, yeah. What did I say, Florida?
Yeah.
But we have a radio in the radio room, which is on the Secret Service net. And that's what we had. And one mission was where we're on 24-hour alert duty. And so we were listening, and then you could hear it coming. You know, they were saying, this is here, he's down, he's here, and this, and on and on. And they eventually got the Air Force One, came back to Edwards, and we were going to, weren't sure how they were going to take the casket out. And so they said, well, had me get my plane and take all the seats out, so in case they were going to take him to Bethesda Hospital for the autopsy and all that, that we could carry him in that one if we took all the seats out. And so I had that plane, was sitting over there waiting for that to happen. I thought, God, can't believe the world. But then Mrs. Kennedy decided that she wanted him in the ambulance with the rest of them go with him, so I didn't have it. But and then later on, it was President Johnson took over, and it's difference in night and day. Where I told my wife after one brief little conversation I had with President Kennedy that I said, probably talk to the greatest man I'll ever talk to. And I was being interviewed by the History Channel, and they asked me the same question, and the guy says, and? And I said, well, it hasn't changed to this day. This is a very, very charismatic personality that was a man's feeling. And I said, he could relax you to the point he was asking me, where was I from? I was born and raised in Seattle. And then he said, how many children do you have? And I said, 6 or 7 at that time. And he says, you sound like a good Catholic boy. And I says, I'm sorry, Mr. President, I'm probably more in the category of a progressive Protestant or something. But, and then there was clicking of the mic, and that meant getting ready to land, so I had to excuse myself. But Bury Magic Man, and LBJ wasn't quite that friendly. And I don't want to go too much into that detail either. But we flew him, and he had to be on your toes because he didn't brief you and didn't have people take care of you. You took care of yourselves and had your act together, or you were caught. And if you were caught something wrong, or even if you didn't get something wrong, you were heading for Adak, Alaska as a messman for the next 10 years or something. But it was an interesting experience. You met a lot of interesting people. We have landed on top of the Pan Am building once when they were trying to get New York Airways to get where they could use that as a helicopter port. And they figured if they flew the president in there, it must be safe enough to use for a port. So they had us in there shooting landings to that. And
Did you fly Eisenhower too? Or?
no, the only thing about Eisenhower was that when they asked me for the this History Channel if I had any information how the mission started, and I said yes. That Eisenhower was up in golfing in Rhode Island about the same time that we were integrating the schools in Little Rock, Arkansas, and we were going to use federal troops to do it. Well, apparently somebody suggested that maybe, Mr. President, you should be in Washington if we have a problem with the forced integration down there. And then he mentioned that you realize how long it would take me to get back. You know, I've got a 20-minute car ride to here, and then a ferry ride across the bay, and then another car ride up to the airport, then Air Force One to there. And he says, isn't there any quicker way? And I said, well, the only thing we have is those Marine helicopters that are up at Quonset Point that bring the mail down. And he says, how long does that take them to get there? And he says, about 20 minutes. He says, good, get them ready. So when the naval aide in Washington heard about it, then he decided, he says, that may be the opening. So he had about 4 of our helicopters in Quantico go up and make practice landings on the White House lawn. So I thought, well, if you have to do it, we've done it. We're ready. And then he came back and landed, and nothing was said, and I thought, well, we practiced for it anyway. And then a while later, I don't know how many, maybe weeks or months it could have been, he was going up to Gettysburg on the farm, because Mamie Eisenhower was up at the farm, and he's getting out of the heat and humidity and he said, boy, you know, I hate that car ride up there. And he said, well, get us one of those helicopters. And so whoever it was to get it, they got an Air Force Bell 2-seater. And he got out there and they got in it. Well, he didn't have his Secret Service people. He didn't have this. He didn't have that. So then they said, send up a couple of those Marine helicopters. When they take off, come up here and load up on the rest of the luggage and all this. And so there were about, I think we had 2 planes that went up there and did it. Maybe been 3. But then they went up and flew to Gettysburg and landed. And everybody's getting ready, and then pretty soon here comes the helicopter with the president. And he looks around and he wonders where all these people came from. He said, oh, we came up in the Marine helicopter. And his remark was something to the effect that apparently I took the wrong taxi. So from there on in, that's how the Navy got involved, and the Marine Corps got involved in the presidential mission.
Okay, right.
Sort of an interesting career. It was an honor, but you knew that if anything ever went wrong,
Front page.
he's no, you know, it's front page, well, under the front page, because you'd be up in Timbuktu and never know it. And it was, I got involved, which I can only discuss some of it. I wrote the SOP for presidential helicopters, and then other things we were writing on that I can't even talk about. And History Channel says, it's been 40 years, Tom, you can talk about it. Says, I can't talk about it. And I said, well, when did you leave Quantico, and where'd you go from there? I said, well, I'd had about 4.5, almost 5 years in HMX, and really interesting experience. But somebody, Secret Service or somebody in the White House told the Marine Corps that I couldn't be transferred anywhere where there's risk of being captured for 2 years.
Mhm.
So then I figured with that, ooh, maybe I know something that I shouldn't have known or whatever. So then through a grapevine, they said, well, you got basically two choices. You can either get you in a division because you're a senior enough and you'll be back shuffling papers back here, or the other option, the only other option you have is being the assistant ops officer or the air operations officer on a helicopter carrier. So I says, I learned the words to anchor away and pack my sea bag. So then I spent 2 years with the Navy on a helicopter carrier.
Okay.
And
where did they go?
well, it seems like every November-ish, they went down to the Caribbean for a 3 or 4 month cruise in the Caribbean. You know, you'd hit Panama and Rosie Roads and some scenic spots down there.
Sounds like tough duty.
That was tough. I used to mention again, you know, it gets, I'm sure the first wife, who's no longer with us, would say that, saying now that I have the comfort of 7 children, and you're fighting loneliness in the Caribbean, and all you can show for your efforts is a swizzle stick collection, that never went over too well. But it was good on the second tour. We also had an opportunity to be the recovery ship for Gemini 11. And we had NASA, and we had all the senators and congressmen aboard the ship. And we were going out and witness a splashdown, and then HDC, where I was working, would control the helicopters getting to where the satellites splashed down and all that kind of stuff. And one of the astronauts was Dick Gordon, who was from the state of Washington at the University of Washington, and had been in some of my flights going through. And with all these bigwigs, you know, it was amazing that I even got a chance to talk to him, but we gave them special keys up in a certain section of the ship. And I came down, and he looked at me, and I looked at him, and he came over and he says, hey, just give me these keys. We'll use Pete's. And he says, take these and we'll meet you up in the stateroom. So off I did. I went up there, and they had things, a show and stage play and all this stuff, and the guys shipping over, and they were giving them plaques and stuff. So then they came in, and they changed once in the helicopter. And listening to them talk, I said, God, on the shower, I said, God, boy, these pages stuck together. You know. So it was interesting. They had them for dinner. Of course, at the dinner, they had so many congressmen and senators stashing around there that never got too much of a chance to talk to them. But when they left, I went out on the flight deck with them, and they were running to get on their helicopter, and I was saying goodbye to them. They got enough pictures of that, so and that was an interesting thing. You know, you go from one thing to another, and so that was our tour down there. And then at the end of the tour, I had my orders to go overseas. That's good. My family's in Virginia, and I gotta be in Vietnam.
Back there.
How do I find enough time to get them home? So they were going to send me over to be a 46 pilot. And I mentioned to somebody, I says, don't you think I should have gone through the school? You know? Well, I'd flown it in Quantico, but I didn't go through a school, so I was legally right. So they said, okay. So they sent me in for 2 or 3 weeks in El Toro to go through 46 school.
Okay.
And they said, God, you know, you're ready for solo already. They says, you know, we're having a problem. We need somebody to help. Could you ferry one of these back from the factory out here? I said, yeah, I can do that. I get a little experience. I think I've ferried one back. And they said, and that was one of the first ones that made it all the way without breaking down somewhere en route.
And where's the factory?
It was back in Bridgeport, or not Bridgeport.
Connecticut?
Near, Philly.
Oh, okay.
You know, it was Boeing,
So
or
it was
like
real-
Vertol then, but now it's Boeing.
Real cross country, full.
Yeah, and you go all the way down the coast and all the way across. Well,
Okay.
the 46s were having a lot of little problems, and they were solving them rapidly, but they weren't having enough to get them in. It was tough getting them all the way across. So that gave me enough time to get my family from there to the east or west coast again.
Back.
And we got them back all on the west coast. And then I went off to Vietnam. Well, you had a lot of thoughts about that. What is this turning to be? And I know helicopters are getting involved more, but I says, boy, when I first got into helicopters, they were used only over neutral territory.
Mm-hmm.
We weren't an offensive weapon,
Right.
or we weren't a defensive target as much. But here we're flying over Indian country, and that can be exciting. So anyway, when I got over there, I was senior enough, and because I got down to the helicopter base at Da Nang, and they said, we're going to have you over Marble Mountain at the helicopter. So I said, good. I checked in, and here it was my commanding officer that had been in HMX when I first checked in. And he said, good. He says, good to see you again, Tom. He says, by the way, he says, you know, I know my predecessor will take care of you, but he says, I'm going to give you a squadron. And even though I know he will. And I said, yeah. I said, but Colonel, you know I'm a reserve officer. And he said, yes, I'm aware of that. And I said, okay. So then I was really picking up. And he said, but the squadron is just being formed. It's one of the first that's been commissioned and outfitted in a combat zone. You know, you're starting off with a Bible and a sergeant major, and then you're going to get people from here and there and there, and the people will send people to you, and that'll be your squadron. And those same people don't always send their best people. So he said, you know all that, but and it worked to our advantage, because every one of those men was professional enough to realize that the squadron that gave him up to this new squadron, his mission in life was to show them that they made a mistake. And it was an availability war. The number of helicopters you had flying every day, because they had more missions and we had 10 times as many. So everybody was on everybody for the availability of the airplane. And it's a new little squadron with these people that would work around the clock 24 hours a day. I think in 8 months out of 14 helicopters, the worst we ever had was 12. And my best day was the day the commanding general from the wing came over, and we'd been hit with rockets and mortars at Marble Mountain and almost wiped out the helicopter fleet. And I was in a little, operating out of a nice little small trailer. And he came down and he said, well, Colonel Miller, he says, I understand at 2 o'clock last night or something that all 12 of your aircraft that you had were down for battle damage. And he says, could you show me some of the helicopters? And I said, I'm sorry, General, they're all out flying. The troops had worked most of the night through and got them all out, and they were all flying. So they were the greatest people in the world, and you talk about falling in and getting a great grade, and it's a tough thing then, and I guess it's tougher now to be realize that you hit the epigee of your, you know, not only your career but your existence. That and yet the people, several of the majors made lieutenant general, and a lot of the enlisted men have done well. Some guys said one was a chief of police somewhere, and another was a head of detectives, and one of the second lieutenants has spent 35 years in the FBI, and so they've all done well. And we get together every so often. So, and when you have a retired general still call you a skipper, it makes you feel pretty good. But like the History Channel asked me, they says that tour in the White House, so flying the presidents, that had to be the most exhilarating and best tour in your military career. I said, no, it was second best. Oh, what was better? I said, being the commanding officer of a squadron in Vietnam in combat.
And what year was that then?
Whether I was there?
Yeah.
I got there late 68 and 69. But you had the greatest people in the world working with you, and they were pros all the way through. We had some days we had better availability out there than they had helicopters in the States at the same time.
Yeah.
But the men worked around the clock, and the only chance I ever got to them, that my sergeant major reminded me last year, was that the day that the group executive officer told you that 2 of your enlisted men were being put on report and wanted you to find out why. And because they had dust and dirt on their locker box or some nonsense. So I said, well, I got a lot of other things going on right now, but he said, I want you to investigate it. So I did, and found out that these two men had flown with my aircraft maintenance officer, and they'd been out on emergency extraction where a recon team had been surrounded, and they were trying to get them out of there alive. And they'd been flying, and they came back about 7:30 at night, and their helicopter was in a down status, needed a generator, and a radio wasn't working or something. And these two men went up to the mess hall and found some bread laying around and made themselves a bread sandwich, and took some old grounds and made themselves some coffee. Then went back and worked on their helicopter till 3 in the morning. Saw that they had a 5 o'clock lunch and slept in their helicopter. So I walked in that colonel's office, the XO's office the next day, and I says, you know, with men like that, we don't have a problem in the world, do we, A.H.? And that sergeant major passed that word around enough times, so. But that's what you got to do. You take care of your people, and I was lucky enough to have the best I've ever worked with in my life. No doubt.
Right.
And then, have I still got tape?
Well, we got more tape.
Okay, because what did I do next? That was Vietnam. Well, that was the end of thing. I came back, and then I was an instructor and an author and an advisor at the Army's Command and General Staff College in
So
Leavenworth, Kansas.
you were still in the Marines then?
Yeah, I was
Okay.
at the staff college there. They had 2 Navy officers, 2 Marine officers, 2 Air Force officers at the Army's Command and General Staff College. And it's any officer that's ever made general in the Army's gone through Leavenworth, Kansas. And so it was another nice plum for me to have. I was on a good track for a reserve who didn't even have a college degree to be an advisor and an instructor at the Army. And spent 2 years there, and that was an interesting career. Spent a lot of time talking with the Army and their helicopter crews. And it was nice being an instructor, and have to write your lesson plans, and then you give the presentations. And sometimes the hardest ones were in the auditorium, where I followed the guide of a commandant that came there, because they'd have every so often they'd have a top secret presentation with the service chiefs from the Army, Navy, and Air Force and Marine Corps. And first General Westmoreland came out, and they read his biography and everything that he'd ever done, and then he was going to give a speech, and he comes up behind the podium and puts on his glasses and starts reading. And some of the men were disappointed that he said he didn't tell us anything we didn't know by reading it in the library. And then Admiral Zumwalt came through, and he was telling them about that the Navy now is concerned on getting good people in their service, and that we're going to have barracks with bigger parking lots and vending machines for beer and stuff in the barracks. And then the Air Force general came in, and the last one, they all seemed to get the habit of going behind the podium and reading. And the last person to speak was the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and his introduction was no biography, was, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Commandant of the United States Marine Corps." He walks out to the center of the stage and started talking. And he informed them that our approach was a little different than some of the other services, because we're all hurting, but that when you join the United States Marine Corps, you're joining us, and you better darn well know it. And the Army officers stood up and applauded.
Oh, great. Okay, we're about out of time.
Yeah, well, I'm it, because then I went from there. I was the executive officer of a group at El Toro, and okay, so we got to the point where I left Leavenworth, Kansas. I had now sufficient time to retire as a reservist. I was lucky to be able to retire, and it was a tough time to know that you had to get out, because I figured with records and everything else, I probably had the tickets to go a little higher, but you don't look a gift horse in the mouth. So I came out to El Toro and spent about 6 to 9 months waiting for retirement, and during this time I was the executive officer of a Marine Wing support group at El Toro.
What did they do?
Well, they had the transport squadron, for one, was their biggest thing, and then they provide a lot of the supply and maintenance for different squadrons there, but it was sort of a sad caper. But then I got out and decided, what am I going to do? And I said, well, we got 7 kids.
And this was what year?
72.
72. Okay.
So I said, well, I got a chance, and they said, we have a wonderful GI Bill. And I said, I only got 2 years plus at the University of Washington, so why don't I go back to college? And I said, well, my wife was wondering, how you going to support this family? And I said, well, fortunately, the GI Bill, by being married, I get a certain figure, but then I get certain more for every child we have. So with 7, I think we might qualify enough just to get by.
Yeah.
So I did. I had went back and went to junior college because I had a lot of California electives, California history, California this that you have to take it out of the way. So I went to Orange Coast College, and 2 semesters there. Got my associate arts degree. Then I went to summer school for 2 sessions and 18 units, and then went to Cal State Fullerton and ended up getting my bachelor's degree the next June. And I thought, well, I'm on a roll, let's keep going. So I decided I'd take a couple more summer courses, and then went, and then I had got a part-time job. I was working, managing a restaurant also. And then the next year I got my master's degree.
And what?
I got master's was in public administration, and my other 2 were in business.
Yeah.
And I said, gosh, now you're probably overqualified for any job you're going to talk to. And the first job I interviewed was funny. The young man was about 25 years old and very sharp, and he wanted to know if I ever had any executive experience. And I says, well, only 24 years commission service in the Marine Corps. Blah, blah, blah. And they wanted to know if you'd ever instructed in Leavenworth, and when students were instructing, I said some of them were going for their doctorate or master's degree from University of Kansas too. And he says, what the other question, all this, he says, you feel qualified? He says, what degrees do you carry now? I said, well, I have a BA and an MA and a master's degree in public administration. And I could see him roll his eyes, and he says, well, we got your number here, we'll give you a call. I said, well, you're going to hear that story more and more, because too much experience and too much schooling at too late of a life. But so then I got out and started managing a restaurant, and it was an aviation restaurant. It's in Santa Ana, California now. It's in Irvine, California. Yeah, he moved. It's called the Newport 17, and it's all an aviation restaurant. It's full of aviation pictures, and they're all autographed by the pilots. And he used to have, of course, it was great when the El Toro was there, because you got a lot of aviators come in from El Toro to the restaurant. Cause great food and great service, and it's basically an aviation museum with pictures.
Mm-hmm.
And they said anybody who's been in aviation's got his picture up there, and he's autographed them. And then every year when the Blue Angels used to come out to El Toro and put on their show, the owner would have them up to the restaurant on Thursday night for dinner for them, and then he'd invite some of his aviation people in there for the special dinner. And he's had every Blue Angel that ever flew in there in his restaurant, got all their pictures on the wall, autographed and all that. So it was being out of the service but still in it. And a lot of it's still like the Air Museum.
Mm-hmm.
You're out of the service but you're still in it, in a way.
Right.
Or you're still living it. And that's, I think that's the beauty, and I think the greatest thing that we have to offer here in this museum is what they mention is the education to the younger generation what sacrifices those people in World War II made to give us what we have today.
Right.
And, I think we're touching base with a lot of them because some all weren't in great big units and little bits and pieces, but they're all part of our history and culture, and they're vital cogs. And one thing I mentioned to you that somebody was asking me about the American flag, and I said, well, I learned that at a very young age with my grandfather, the old sea captain again. And he took me down when I was 5 years old to my first 4th of July parade. And we're in Seattle, Washington, and parade's coming down First Avenue, and we're sitting there between Pike and Pine, right in front of the old Liberty Theater. And he saw that I was getting nudgy, so he had me sit on the curb, and I'm sitting there looking across the street at another kid looking at me, and we're wondering if we're having fun yet, what kids do. And then pretty soon you could hear the band coming over the little rise, and pretty soon my grandfather says, okay, Tommy, he says, here they come. He says, here comes the color guard. He says, and here comes our flag. He said, now you stand up, and you stand as tall and straight as you can, because the day that flag goes by in front of you, and you don't, do it again, get a lump in your throat or tears in your eyes, something is dreadfully wrong. And I turned around and looked up at my grandfather, who was probably as closest to God anybody I've ever known. His hat is over his heart, and his tears are pouring down his cheeks. And I said, you think that in 24 years in the Marine Corps diminish your appreciation of that flag? Wrong. And it's the Marine Corps, the spirit they give you. And just like I told you earlier, still spending the rest of my life proving I was. But it's a great career, and so many people have had it, and so many people have contributed to it that you're sitting here trying to give back what a lot of them gave to you. And same for my high school. I had a wonderful time there, and that's why I drive 16 years up there by myself to go to a reunion. And here you're in Southern California, and they're all in Seattle, and you're the chairman for the 50th reunion and the 60th. And I said, well, that's the reason both of them are the highest records in the history of the school, for the largest class ever to come back for their 50th, and same for the 60th. I says, you just, something gets you and you do it.
Right.
But anyway, it's, I think we owe a lot, I know I do, to the GI Bill. I know a lot of people look at it and they say, well, it's a way to get a lot of those returning GIs off of the work market, because there wasn't enough work going on. But I said they were also a blessing when I got out of high school, and one of my classmates mentioned this to me. He was the dean of history, so he probably should know. He says, why we had as many as 70-some% of our graduating class go to college, and today close to 80% of them have college degrees. He said, we were brought up during the Depression and the war years. I used to think President Roosevelt was the only president we'd ever had. And from here to there, he was the president.
Yeah.
But you got to the point, and then we got out of high school, and we went to college, on my lark, wondering, what am I doing? But we were blessed by having all the returning GIs from World War II. And when I'm going down there with my squirrely friends going to a football game on Saturday, and you see them studying up in their temporary barracks,
Right.
and you tell them, it's a great game, it's Washington and UCLA, and oh, you're missing a great game. Well, Monday morning when I took my chemistry exam, and I looked at the grade, and I thought, boy, that's about a mid B. It was a low D. We had more of max things, and this was happening in every class. They knew why they were in college, and they had the discipline, which we didn't have, and it was that spurred, and the history professor could prove it. All of us that went to college or wherever we went, you had those people hitting the ball that hard, you had to, or you wouldn't have lasted past your sophomore year. Then I even joined a fraternity, because my dad had joined a fraternity, and he did well. So my grandmother says when my grandfather left my brother and I money to go to college, says, your dad did really well. He says, you can join a fraternity if you want to. Well, I didn't even know what a fraternity was, you know, it's some pack. But we joined, and I lived out on the campus. But then again, all 75% of the brothers had been World War II veterans. And if that isn't a great education for a 17 and 18-year-old kid to know what's important in this world and what isn't.
Right.
You learn to study, you learn to have a good time, but you grew up fast, and so that's another blessing. And you have a lot of blessings through life, and I just wonder if today's kids even know which ones they're having.
That's true.
But you mentioned something on these decorations, and most of them are being at the right place at the right time. But
Now tell us which ones you have there.
well, the only ones that that were a little more difficult to get was the presidential one, and I had that one presented by President Johnson to me. And then before that one, they used to have just this White House service badge, which was the white one. And then these are again unit ones, but I got the Legion of Merit with the Combat V, and I've only got 15 or 20 air medals. And then
How did you get the Legion of Merit? That's
that
was French?
No, that's not the French one. This is ours for it's primarily for being the commanding officer of a squadron that started with nothing. And then after my 8 months in the squadron, then I was going to have to move up to another job. And then they made me the operations officer, and now responsible for 7 squadrons. And you trim that down, and you did some things there where hadn't been done, and they sort of liked it, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And the air medals, the only thing I'm sad about there is I never flew as much as I wanted to. Because, you know, you're responsible for a squadron and getting it up and on and running. And just like my major that is now a lieutenant general, he was my maintenance officer, and he not only had the planes always flying, but he was always flying himself. That he says they were coming out with this 3M system where you had to keep track of all the hours it took you to put parts on an airplane. And they had this new reporting system on computerized thing, and he was saying, I've got to go, and he said, half of my people have got to go to that stupid school, and we don't have time because we're busy in the planes. I said, I'll take care of it. I'll go to the school for you. And I did. I went up and learned it, and played with the cards, and I said, no, we got it, and you stay working. And their record speaks for itself, so I don't need it. And the rest of them are just being in Vietnam, and this was Vietnam, and this was Korea, and it's only, what did I say, 19?
Yeah. That's
Well, right place, right time.
well, it's certainly something to be proud of. We've
Well,
had a
Yeah.
very interesting and outstanding career. So.
Well, I'd like to take more credit for it, but a lot of it, you have the good Lord and a lot of people helping you, and you can be still the old sow looking for the acorn, and when they say that's a golden acorn, you can't say because I saw it was golden, that's why I took it. No.
Well, you still have to perform, or else you wouldn't be getting the chance.
And I saw a lot of the world. You know, I was sitting there, got to look at it here, and I said, God, when you go to, some of them said, you go to Korea, and then Bikini, and out in Atomic, and then you go to Okinawa, and you're in Thailand, you're in Cuba, and you're in Vietnam. I said, I never got many tours to Europe. I never got some of those good ones.
Yeah.
But I said, that makes you too.
Well.
Yeah.
And where are all your children now?
Well, my number 3 son is my landlord. He's one of the leading salesmen in real estate in Coachella Valley, and he's been at it now for about 3 years or 4.
Mm-hmm.
But he puts in the time and the energy, and he's doing extremely well. My daughter is moving to La Quinta.
Oh.
One of my sons is in Huntington Beach with his family of four children, and my grandkids. I have about 13 grandchildren. And on my second marriage, she had 4 children, and 2 of them were younger and 2 of them were older. But out of all of them, I say I got about 13 grandchildren. And they say, gosh, with 7 and 4, that isn't many children for that many kids. I says, it is when only 3 of them are married.
Yeah.
But, you know,
So
you
the
know,
rest of them are spread out over the country?
yeah, some of my, the second 4, or most of them are in Florida, but mostly in California. See, all of mine are in California right now, right? And closer here than we've been.
Okay.
I had an interesting thing, I know when they're talking about jobs, and I listen to kids and how much money they're making. I found out that my first job I ever had was, I had to be in about the 5th grade, and was pulling weeds, and I got paid 3 cents an hour. And then one day I was setting bowling pins, and you got paid 11 cents a line or something, and I dodged more pins and things, and I thought, this is this is not for me.
Need a football helmet.
Yeah, oh, you need to
keep your
go.
teeth.
That was spooky, you know, and doing doubles, you're jumping from one to the other like a yo-yo. And then they opened up a swimming pool, and I got the first job, or one of them there as a locker room attendant. You know, you guys come up, you give them a bag, you put your clothes in it, and I give you a pen and all that. And I was making a rollicking $3 a day, and I thought,
Wow.
God, this is mega bucks. And then 2 years later, I got a job as a lifeguard. And boy, at $5 an hour, I was really stacking money away. But that's also about the time my stepfather, I call him my dad, I had the blessing of having 2 dads, that he says, now that you're making big money, he says, you're going to have to learn to pay some room and board.
Uh-oh.
You know, it was something like you have to pay your mother 25 cents a week or something. And I thought, God, this is cruel and unusual punishment. I never heard of such thing. But he says, well, teach you a good lesson. You got to learn that when you make that money, you don't get to keep it all. It has to go somewhere.
Yeah.
And it would, you know, and he and my grandfather both said every time I ever worked, I had to put half of it in the bank.
That's good philosophy.
Yeah, and every cent or every dollar you have in the bank is a friend you have until you spend him.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've had those jobs. I work in logging camps. Been an author. First book I decided to write was, I was a football nut since 1957 and followed them, so I was going to make a trivia book on Pacific Coast football, Washington, Oregon, and California, and all the schools. And I used to work in this restaurant where a lot of the sports writers would come in from the Santa Ana Register, and we'd come up with all these trivia questions. You know, what football manager at this college ended up president of the United States? Well, it was Hubert Hoover. And
Really?
which golfer did this, and what guy played in the World Series, and that, and on and on and on. So I said, you guys should write a book. Well, they never did, so I did.
Mm-hmm.
And it was Pac-10 football trivia and record book.
Okay.
And I got that published, and that was a day that somebody says, you're no longer a writer. I said, oh? I said, no, now you're an author, because you've been published.
Okay. Great.
So then I've been in genealogy, and I've written 3 or 4 books on genealogy, more giving something back to the West Seattle, the neighborhood I was born and raised in. When I went to BYU, they mentioned that you should give something back to the discipline that you found enjoyment in. So I said, good, for Seattle, what I've done, I've gone back, and the first settlers landed there in about 1853. I've done the 1860, 70, 80, 90 federal census. Then I went on to the, where did I leave off? 90, yeah. 1910, 20, and I got the 30, but I haven't done it.
Okay.
The 1930 census was the first one I found my name in.
Uh-huh.
But what I've done is taken the federal census and all the information I put in by the year just for West Seattle. And then 6 years ago, I decided that there's only one cemetery in West Seattle. So I was going up to inventory that.
Hmm.
And they had several different owners, so they all had different numbering for the same sections and plots. So after playing with that for about a year and a half. I broke their code. So then I'd list them, and then I got 5 of my classmates, and they would go out, and I'd have a listing by row, who should be in it, and they'd correct the spelling, and then we wrote the birth dates and death dates. And we just finished it up, I think, hopefully, last summer, for 36,000 people in that cemetery, where we got where they were at, their birth dates, and the death dates of every one of them. And I told my kids, I says, the reason I'm doing it is that anybody that ever lived in West Seattle was on a federal census, or any one of them that's ever buried in West Seattle up to this date, I've got them. And this is where they're at, and anybody 100 years from now wants to look and find them, there they are.
Very good.
So I says, you know, I pick weird things to do, I guess,
Keep them busy.
but you get a lot of motivation.
Right.
The motivator is usually a big man.
Uh,
So that's about as much as I got going. I've still got
Okay.
a lot of good ideas here in the museum to keep me out of mischief.
Very good. Okay, well, we thank you for your interview.
I'm more than glad to do it.
Thank you
Yeah,
for your service, and
Well, I'd like to take more credit, but I know there's a lot more that done 1,000 times more than I have. But you got to have a little humility in yourself, even though you know you're the greatest person on earth.
okay.
But thank you anyway, Darryl. I appreciate your getting ear fatigue listening to all this stuff.